Fox News alert. Let's go out to Colorado now. Colorado movie massacre trial now moving on to phase 3. This is happening right now. Let's listen in to the judge.
Proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing. The answer is yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 7, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Matthew McQuinn. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer is yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 8, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Michaela Medic. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer, yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 9, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Veronica Mosher Sullivan. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer is yes, and all of the jurors signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 10, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Alex Sullivan. Does the jury unanimously find...
All right, we are listening to the judge in Centennial, Colorado right now, reading through every victim in the Colorado movie theater massacre and saying that the jury has decided unanimously to move forward to phase 3, ultimately and potentially to the death penalty phase for James Holmes. Well, I want to go now to Brian Claypool to get a legal opinion on this. So, Brian, it really does come down to, I guess now when they go to phase 3, they're going to hear from the victims' families, and it's going to be a question and answer type of situation rather than victim statement and testimony. So it's going to come down to this question for jurors: do we execute people who are mentally ill, right?
Well, yes, Gretchen, but I've got to tell you, the fact that the jury deliberated only 2.5 hours and found that the mitigating factors did not outweigh the aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt, this does not bode well for James Holmes in phase 3. I agree with Dan. His best chance at getting off on the death penalty was in phase 2. He is likely to be executed to death. But then you're going to have another issue that's going to arise, Gretchen. If the jury comes back in phase 3 and says, yes, we are for sure sentencing you to death, you're going to have an issue raised by Holmes's lawyers as to whether it's constitutional to sentence to death James Holmes. You might have to have another mental exam, for example, to determine what his IQ is, to make that determination as to whether he can, in fact, be executed, because the jury's already found that he has a mental illness.
And Brian, politics always factors into anything when we're talking about the death penalty, but that's not going to factor into what the jurors are going to decide when they go now to phase 3. So how do you see this playing out? I explained earlier that they heard from the family of James Holmes in phase 2 to try and present these mitigating factors that they hoped would outweigh what the prosecution was saying. Now we're going to hear from the victims. How is that going to play out, Brian?
Well, it's not going to help James Holmes, because you're going to hear from the victims. You're going to hear the how terrible this is in their life, how they've lost loved ones, and this can only bring worse things for James Holmes. I don't see, Gretchen, how phase 3 can really help James Holmes at all. I think the arguments that had to have been made feverishly were that in James Holmes' diary, Gretchen, he actually wrote the word, I think, at least 50 times, the word why. He kept saying why in his diary. And he even said in there, you know, I have a broken mind. So I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by this verdict, because when Holmes is saying why, he's basically reaching out and saying, okay, wait a minute, I know I'm planning this thing, but somebody help me, because I don't really know why, and I don't really want to do this.
Right.
So his lawyers really have to try to weave in something like that in phase 3.
Well, help me understand from a legal point of view mitigation and aggravation. So here's one thing that I read. When does mitigation outweigh aggravation? When the mitigation is the cause of the aggravation. So in this case, I guess mental illness caused him, obviously, to shoot in the theater. But the jury is disagreeing with that today and saying that the mitigating factors did not outweigh the aggravating ones, correct?
Right. You hit the nail on the head, Gretchen, and that's why I'm a little bit surprised. Because if I'm sitting in that jury box and I'm hearing all the experts, Gretchen, let's set the record straight. All of the experts in the case have said that James Holmes has a mental illness.
Yeah, but
that's
whether
powerful.
or not, but whether or not he knew right from wrong, though, see, that's the difference. That's what Dan Springer was just saying, that it was 2 and 2.
No, I understand it, but it was, my point is this: it was 4-0 that he had a mental illness. It's very unprecedented across the country when a defendant is found to have a mental illness that he is sentenced to death. That's all I'm saying. I agree that it's 2-2 on whether he knew right from wrong, but still, you have 2 experts saying he didn't know right from wrong, and then you've got his diary. To me, the most powerful evidence in the case was him writing those words. Why? To me, this was a guy reaching out for help. I'm not excusing what he did,
right,
but that's why I'm a little bit surprised by this verdict.
All right, and the judge is just now releasing the jurors. So, Brian, as we wrap up what's happened here today, once again, it's a complicated system in Colorado. Phase 1, they found James Holmes guilty of these 12 murders. Then they moved to Phase 2, and that was whether or not the mitigating factors outweighed the aggravating ones. In other words, will he go on to possibly face the death penalty? Today, what we're seeing is the jurors unanimously say yes. So now, Brian, we move on to this Phase 3. Complicated system in Colorado, right?
It's complicated, Gretchen, but it's in place to make sure the jury gets the decision right. And as you noted earlier, Colorado is a very liberal state. That's why they have a 3-phase process. But I want to reiterate that James Holmes will be sentenced to death, because the real death penalty phase of this case was Phase 2. His best shot at getting out was Phase 2. These victim impact statements will do nothing but hurt him more tomorrow or the following day.
All right, Dan Springer, Brian Claypool, great to have you both on board as this has been happening live right here on The Real Story. Thanks much.